Okay. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elaine Natalie, and I'm a policy fellow at the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, or APLN for short. And on behalf of APLN and BASIC's Emerging Voices Network, we warmly welcome you to the special panel on the search for nuclear justice. And just very briefly, for those of you who might not be familiar with APLN and EVN, so APLN is an independent organization and network of over 150 figures from 22 countries across the Asia Pacific, focused on addressing defense and security challenges, specifically nuclear weapons risks. And EVN is a digital global network of high potential early career researchers on nuclear weapons and nuclear policy issues. So we are delighted to host experts and early career researchers from diverse backgrounds today, including Mona Lisa Hazarka from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Ruairí Devereaux-Heddon from Utrecht University, Ekaterina Lapanovic from Ural Federal University, Dr. Anais Moore from Rutgers University, and Ian Fleming-Zoe from the Arms Control Negotiation Academy. I'll be introducing the speakers in more detail as we proceed. And Dr. Becky Alexis Martin, who was also supposed to speak today, sends her apologies as she unfortunately won't be able to join us due to an urgent health issue. And so today we will delve into fundamental questions surrounding nuclear justice and its increasing significance in the global nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament discourse. So the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW, has also been instrumental in shedding much needed light on the role of international law and the international community in addressing issues such as victim assistance and environmental remediation for all those affected by past nuclear tests and uses. So our aim today is to explore policy priorities and recommendations that can urgently push for realizing nuclear justice, especially concerning victim assistance and environmental remediation. So each speaker will have around 7 minutes to deliver their remarks, which will be followed by comments from our two discussants before we open the floor up to Q&A and further discussion, which will be led by my colleague from EVN, Declan Penrose. And this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording on both the BASIC and APLN websites following the event as a resource for anyone interested. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker, Mona Lisa Hazarka. Mona Lisa is an intern in the dual use and arms trade control program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Hailing from Guwahati, India, Mona Lisa holds a master's in conflict management and development and has formerly worked at the Forum on the Arms Trade and Scrap Weapons. She's a 2023 emerging expert under the Forum on the Arms Trade and was recently selected as one of the UN Youth Champions for disarmament under the UNODA's Youth for Disarmament Initiative. And Mona Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aline, for your very kind introduction. My name is Mona Lisa Hazarka. I am one of the UN Youth Champions for Disarmament and currently work as a knowledge exchange and impact consultant at Scrap Weapons. Today, I would like to talk briefly about the complex history of the impact of uranium mining, especially on indigenous communities and native land, which has not been in the vein of focus within the broader nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament discourse, but of course warrants our attention while talking about nuclear justice. While the focus has primarily been on the most visible parts of the life cycle of nuclear weapons or reactors, there has been surprisingly little discussion concerning the production of the radioactive raw material from the preliminary exploration of the uranium deposits to the final packaging of uranium oxide, which seems to be slight under the radar. Now, this contested element has been at the spectrum ends of the resource curse, depending on the bane or the boon narrative, but the resultant patterns of inequitable pollution distribution as a result of policy and legal decision pretty much seems like a package deal. The contemporary manifestation of these exclusionary practices are no longer overt, evident through housing discrimination, targeting of low-income communities for polluting operations, underrepresentation in the policy and legal spheres, unequal distribution of benefits, lesser pay for the same work, being hired as unskilled laborers. And I can keep going on and on for all these various practices, but they are just some of the examples that we have seen so far. Further, on the health aspect, the mutagenic diseases induced by low level of radiation appear only after a long period of cumulative effect and often after contact with the radioactive substance has ceased. Now, given the fact that the estimated 70% of the world's uranium deposits were found on native land, the extraction and exploitation in the name of quote-unquote national defense points to the inherent radioactive colonialism that stands in stark contrast to the protection of human rights and the environment. The native communities globally often find themselves at the crosshairs of strategic power grabs and have been historically falling behind in nuclear waste remediation, especially when it comes to speed and accuracy. The asymmetrical power distribution misinterpretation of the legacy of radioactive contamination and whitewashing of the historically disadvantageous experiences by decision makers by dodging their issues on the grounds of quote unquote no single source of contamination could be established have left a toxic legacy for the generations to come. The ardent neglect and abandonment of these groups are reflected in the inequitable distribution of pollution backed by their biased policies that sideline their experiences to fulfill the priorities of those in power. That traditional knowledge is discounted as wishful thinking and emotional hodgepodge, not aligned with the current anarchic world politics. Now, from the Navajo nations in the United States to the tribal plains of Jadugora in India, the lives of indigenous communities worldwide have been severely impacted by nuclear weapons industry, including uranium mining, milling, enrichment, and also nuclear waste storage and disposal. I can share an example of a lesser-known case in India's northeast, where the village of Domyasiat, which is located in the state of Meghalaya, where 9.2 million tons of high-grade uranium ore deposits were found by the Atomic Mineral Directorate of India under its KPM uranium mining project back in the 1970s and 80s. While the project didn't go through due to massive opposition, the exploratory mining resulted in over 650 tons of contaminated tailings, which were left unprotected at the mining sites and later covered by concrete pits. Now, when the reports of the leakages were revealed, a local environmental researcher documented the botched job back in 2020, where he recorded ionizing radiation of over 1,000 counts per minute and radiation levels fluctuating between 235 and 315 counts per minute in a few other areas, which of course points to the irreversible damage that has already been done. Now, having an understanding of some of these fundamental concepts of environmental racism and justice is essential to recognize the disproportionate burden of nuclear pollution and contribute to the discussion around nuclear justice. I think as researchers or activists, it would be interesting to look at scientific studies and researches on not just environmental and occupational impact, but also birth and reproductive health outcomes to radioactive exposure, and explore how that relates to the victim assistance and environmental remediation. So finding out ways to utilize and streamline the limited and often inconsistent data for policy consideration in the nuclear sphere. In the interest of time, as policy priorities, I would recommend increasing technical assistance and funding to assess the potentially contaminated sites by developing a concrete action plan, and inclusion of indigenous people at the national and policy level spaces to address the root causes of these injustices. Incorporating the reported lessons onto the agenda for remediation and rehabilitation will go a long way towards reducing the marginalization experiences and devolving power structures. Above all, maintaining relationship with community stakeholders based on respect, understanding, patience, and a willingness to listen and exchange knowledge and ideas are crucial to negotiating support for projects and to reach the creation of a shared value. That's all from me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mona Lisa. That was very informative. And yeah, I think the extensive impacts of uranium mining on Native communities is very fundamental to our conversation today. So thank you for speaking on that. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our second speaker, Ruairí Devereaux-Heddon. Ruairí is an independent researcher with a focus on international law and humanitarian disarmament, specifically on post-conflict environmental remediation and victim assistance. He has previously held positions in the Disarmament Division of the European Union Delegation to the UN in Geneva, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, and the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. He is pursuing a Master of Laws in Public International Law, Conflict and Security at Utrecht University, where he is writing his master's thesis on nuclear weapons testing and avenues for environmental justice for affected communities. And Ruairí, please go ahead.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Mona Lisa, for these lovely remarks. Nuclear justice as a term is quite context specific, I believe. So if you were to put it into the context of the NPT, for example, I'm sure a lot of states would argue that there is a great injustice within the NPT built in with regards to Article 6 disarmament obligations and the haves have not dynamic. But in a more broad sense, nuclear injustice is perhaps best seen in regards to the affected communities and the infected environment, which has resulted from over 2,000 nuclear tests and 2 uses in conflict. So there are well-documented examples of countless deaths, long-term damage, multi-generational illnesses, trauma, social and economic exclusion, and displacement. And as well as this, the damage to the environment is no less severe, with extensive contamination of vegetation, water sources, wildlife, radioactive material, rendering large tracts of lands entirely unusable. So nuclear justice then seeks to acknowledge our accountability to future generations and to somewhat right the wrongs that have gone on. And nuclear justice as a concept largely reflects the more victim-centric mindset that nuclear weapons discourse is moving towards, and moving away from ideas of state sovereignty, national security, and ideas like this. And I think that this is most clear from not only the development of humanitarian disarmament regimes such as the TPNW and others, but also in growing efforts within human rights fora, such as the Human Rights Council, where there are growing efforts to recognize the impact that nuclear weapons testing has on, for example, Article 6 of the ICCPR and the right to life. And there's great efforts by civil society to encourage states to include these human rights obligations within their universal periodic reviews, for example. So I think that increasingly we see that nuclear justice is not simply a disarmament issue or an IHL issue, but it's a more multi-dimensional issue, which requires a more involved response. So where does the TPNW fit into all of this? I think that the codification into international law of not just a prohibition on nuclear weapons, but also these positive obligations within Article 6 of the obligation to provide victim assistance and environmental remediation are really key steps towards achieving nuclear justice. And these positive obligations within the TPNW have also contributed to a large normative shift, not just within the TPNW, but elsewhere as well. We've seen it recently with the UNGA First Committee resolution, but also last year in the NPT RevCon, there was considerable efforts to include positive obligations and, as a result, nuclear justice within NPT's disarmament pillar, which was the first time that this was done. And it really represents a shift towards a more inclusive regime, which includes the victims. And while the report did fail to garner consensus, this language within the disarmament pillar was largely unopposed. So what do these positive obligations actually look like when we put them into practice? I think that victim assistance is obviously a crucial element to nuclear justice. For too long, victims have been marginalized, ignored, and isolated as they suffer from the horrific consequences of nuclear weapons testing and use. Those located near test sites often are indigenous populations, and they suffer from cancers, death, organ failures, and also an actual alteration of their DNA owing to radiation. So those who are suffering from illnesses then are often incapacitated, unable to work, and then have extreme medical consequences as well, and bills, which I think really clearly paint a picture of nuclear injustice. So how does the TPNW then seek to remedy this? I think in Article 6, Part 1 of the TPNW, it calls for states to provide adequate assistance to those in their affected territories. But I think that it's not entirely clear what this means in practice. So I think one of the useful examples for us at the moment to look at in creating a victim assistance regime is what exactly a victim assistance regime can look like. And one interesting example at the moment is RECA, which is in place in the United States, and it's currently undergoing a revision. A bipartisan bill has been put forward to expand RECA, and I think that looking at the problems that they have found with RECA in the US can provide some example of where we need to take an optimum victim assistance policy moving forward. And I think that some of the main issues with RECA were that it was, geographically limited. It was limited, medically speaking, to just a number of diseases, and all of them physical, and also didn't include the affected communities. It wasn't transparent, and it was based on a lump sum payment, which was, unadjusted for inflation. So there's a lot of problems with RECA that I think we can learn from, and as we try to craft an optimum victim assistance regime in light of nuclear justice. Okay, so this is one of the large pillars with respect to nuclear justice. I think that the TPNW codifies, but the other large element to this is environmental remediation. Environmental remediation is essential because when nuclear weapons are used or tested, both the short and long-term effects can have devastating effects on the environment. Nuclear fallout results can render large tracts of land unusable, interfering with the ability to grow crops and raise livestock, and also lead to secondary effects, such as we've seen in the Marshall Islands, where the inability to fish has led to a dependence on foreign aid, which has then led to health effects such as diabetes from imported food substances which weren't native. So you can really see how this expands to other elements as well. So one of the interesting things that the TPNW drafters did, and one of the interesting things for me as a lawyer, we're very focused on terminology. They've chosen to use the term remediation instead of what other treaties, such as, for example, the Semipalatinsk Treaty, which use the term rehabilitation. So rehabilitation essentially implies that there is this state that we can get back to, a form that existed before the testing took place, that we should work towards rehabilitating entirely. And I think that what the TPNW does, which is maybe unique to this regime, is that it recognizes that the impact of this radiation on the environment, on the ecosystem, on the flora and fauna, including individuals, and on those living in the affected areas. So it may not be something that we can entirely fix, owing to the geographical and temporal scope of this material. It may not be something we can entirely fix. And this is reflective as well in other areas of the TPNW. It points towards the, catastrophic consequences, which may not be able to be fixed. And we should work towards this. So I think that this is really an important element of environmental remediation, that we don't aim to clean up or rehabilitate, but we actually have this progressive goal that requires optimization, and that we work towards something not in terms of years, but in terms of centuries and maybe even thousands of years, given the nature of this material. And while also we look forward, it's important that we can also look back for inspiration as well. We can look at other humanitarian disarmament regimes, such as the Cluster Munitions Convention, which speaks a lot about clearance and risk reduction, for examples on how we can best promote environmental remediation. And I know I'm caught for time, but we can also then inform this with the material-specific needs of nuclear material, and we can use a lot of the reporting from the International Atomic Energy Agency and their environmental remediation programs to inform what this environmental remediation element would look like in practice. So I think, yeah, for policy priorities with regards to remediation, it really relies on a dynamic approach with proper planning, optimization throughout, inclusion of all individuals and affected communities, as well as civil society and international organizations, sensitivity to gender and age, and also a collaborative effort with many states parties. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Rory, for your excellent insights. And yeah, putting nuclear justice in the broader context of various multidimensional issues is very helpful. So thank you for that. And I'll now go straight into introducing our third speaker, Ekaterina Lapanovic. Ekaterina is a senior lecturer at Ural Federal University, where she leads the program on international cooperation in sustainable development and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Her focus is on nuclear technologies and human security and the interplay between strategic and humanitarian approaches to nuclear weapons. Ekaterina is a member of the Young Deep Cuts Commission, a subsidiary of the trilateral Germany-Russia-US Deep Cuts Commission that develops fresh ideas to revitalize nuclear arms control and disarmament. Ekaterina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elaine, for your very kind introduction. I hope you can hear me well, and thank you, APLN and BASIC, for the opportunity to be a part of that very important, I believe, and very timely discussion. And thank you, Mona Lisa and Rory, for your very thoughtful remarks. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel with you. Given that my state, Russia, is a nuclear weapon state, answering maybe the first question for our webinar, I will focus not on what is nuclear justice, but how is that to provide nuclear justice. And to provide nuclear justice ideally means to act upon a reflective understanding that the production of nuclear deterrence was and is systematically accompanied by the production of risks and hazards. And practically, it means to respond to what Chris Rose-Smith and Aisha Zarakol call polymorphic claims of justice that interact and intersect in complex ways in the international system. Among those identified by the authors I just mentioned are 6 such claims, like recognitional, distributive, institutional, historical, epistemic, and finally intergenerational justice. But actually, in my remarks, I'm not going to dissect nuclear justice, as I truly believe that really great job was done by great experts around the world. Maybe among the most recent pieces is that written by Rebecca Davis-Gibbons as a part of Unideas from the Margins to the Mainstream. In her piece, Rebecca Davis-Gibbons states that one of the most common justice mechanisms sought by victims in their testimonials is actually policy change that would make sure no one else would suffer as victims of the use and testing did. And policy change to reduce or eliminate the chance of nuclear use or testing would be the ultimate form of acknowledgement, and it would help repair relationships in society. In an attempt to answer the other question for our webinar, which is why nuclear justice is essential, I will again approach it, in that nuclear weapon state-centered way, like why and how policy change is essential for nuclear weapon states and how it is in their interest to provide justice. And I focus on interest here, as I believe that it is the way to approach it while promoting that ideas to nuclear weapon states. So nuclear weapon states should be worried about the deep crisis of the global nuclear order and its cornerstone, the NPT. Rory has already mentioned that crisis around the disarmament pillar. And to mitigate that and repair relationships, nuclear weapon states should address legitimate concerns that the order has always been unjust and is becoming increasingly so. The following questions raised for the panel are: firstly, which policies need to be pushed urgently for releasing nuclear justice, especially concerning victim assistance and environmental remediation? And secondly, which international instruments and arrangements are most important for pursuing nuclear justice? On the side of nuclear weapon states, the policy that needs to be pursued is that of engagement with a non-dismissal of the issue. And I do understand that that is very generic, and that is the basics, but we still don't have, unfortunately, that on the side of nuclear weapon states in their relationships with non-nuclear weapon states suffered. We're referring one more time to that idea of nuclear disarmament as the form of acknowledgement. I would like to highlight the following developments. The topic of victim assistance and environmental remediation did get some traction at the NPT PrepCom in Vienna, with a number of states, including nuclear allied states, called for engagement on the subject. And Kazakhstan and Kiribati also tabled the working paper on nuclear testing, in which they called nuclear weapon states for engagement and information sharing. But I believe truly importantly, they also said in that working paper, it would help to ease tensions on the NPT and demonstrate disarmament commitment, it meaning engagement on victim assistance and environmental remediation. And I do believe that this linkage should stay, as it is a workable way to go with nuclear weapon states and promote that ideas about victim assistance and environmental remediation. And I believe that issues of victim assistance and environmental remediation should definitely be raised within the NPT framework. As for instruments and arrangements suitable for deliberations in victim assistance and environmental remediation and the interstate level, as in my research, I focus primarily on that, like interstate level, and issues of victim assistance and environmental remediation in relationships between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. So I believe that multilateral inclusive, meaning nuclear weapon states aboard, like ideal framework to deal with nuclear justice, is neither feasible nor even maybe needed, as it won't be functional. And there is a good reason to suppose that for some states like mine, Russia included, if feasible, maybe the only feasible, if at all, way to go is to deal with that sensitive issues bilaterally. And to add to the feasibility point, it seems that for some nuclear weapon states, again, mine included, engagement on environmental remediation and not victim assistance may be more likely because of its being less sensitive. And as for Russia, there is some basis for cooperation in specifically environmental remediation with affected states. I mean efforts on environmental remediation in states affected by uranium mining and processing. Mona Lisa focuses specifically and on that issue, and Ruairí also shared with us that approach that remediation is different from rehabilitation, but maybe we will discuss it at a later stage if there are questions. So actually some efforts were put into that in states affected by uranium mining and processing, and the program was that on recultivation of territories of states impacted by uranium mining industry, and it was implemented together with Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan under the auspices of the Commonwealth of independent states. So it was launched in 2013 for the duration of 10 years. As for Kyrgyzstan, plans to develop new bilateral assistance program lasting until the 2030s are already in place. As for Kazakhstan, for example, and remediation of territories affected by nuclear testing, the recent establishment of the Semipalatinsk nuclear safety zone to inter alia rehabilitate again this from the territory of the former Semipalatinsk nuclear test site provides Russia with an opportunity of engagement. That sort of engagement is reasonable, I believe, and is unlikely, in my view, to negatively affect Russia's strategic interests and security concerns. So it is worth pursuing. And maybe coming to an end of my remarks, despite the fact that in my previous remarks I focused entirely on the interstate segment, I do believe that other frameworks are not less valuable and maybe actually were feasible. And with my friends and colleagues like Laura Lepsy from Germany and Elaine Pons Blancas from Mexico, we co-authored an article on redressing the legacy of nuclear testing for arms control today that was out in January. And in this article, we promote the idea about convening a conference on the legacy of nuclear testing, the one with a rather database, technical outlook. In the year of 2026, for example, the CTBT's 30th anniversary year would be a good rallying point for that sort of initiative. And we do believe that remediation and assistance issue we proposed to put in the front is a part of a wider humanitarian agenda and should not be treated as a battlefield for opposing ideological views, but instead pursued as an evidence-based discussion. I guess that I stop here and looking forward to our discussion and to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ekaterina, for sharing your insights, especially on the need to bring nuclear weapon states into this conversation as well. And we will now turn straight to our two discussants who will help us kickstart the discussion portion of this webinar. So first, we have Dr. Anaïs Moore, Assistant Professor of French and Comparative Literature at Rutgers University. Raised in Maui Nui, her research foregrounds how Pacific artists and activists have resisted environmental racism in Oceania, from the genocidal epidemics of earlier centuries to our contemporary period of nuclear colonialism and carbon imperialism. In addition to her academic work, Anaïs strives to facilitate decolonial dialogue across cultures and languages and is involved in various translation projects to bring the indigenous literature of the French-occupied Pacific to an Anglophone audience. She has also recently published a book titled The Ocean on Fire, Pacific Stories from Nuclear Survivors and Climate Activists. Anaïs, please go ahead.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you so much to our three amazing speakers. You presented such important insights from a wide diversity of perspectives, really trying to bring to life what is the core of the anti-nuclear movement. What happens somewhere affects everyone, and you're really putting this global perspective in your joint remarks. My questions for this panel are embedded in a few remarks that I want to first share with you. First of all, we should acknowledge the beauty of the anti-nuclear movement and of the nuclear justice movement is that we are not asking for retributive justice. We're not trying to punish the perpetrators. As a movement, we have embraced reparative justice. The focus is to repair the harm that has been done to the victims and to the environment. But that comes with several questions that I would love to hear your thoughts on. And you've begun to answer it in each context, each geographic and cultural context that you've discussed. Who are the victims? It's not just people with radiation-induced diseases. Everybody is affected, whether through displacement, which would better be described as dislocation, the violent displacement of communities impacted by radiation, whether through changes in the economic opportunities, whether people are first to turn to a wage economy. But so there's a broad geographic scope of who are the victims, but there's also a broad temporal scope of who are the victims. We could include the non-born victims, all of the fetuses, all of the babies who will never see the light of day. And we also include, as Mona Lisa mentioned, future victims, as mutagenic diseases will continue to affect future generations. That's the first question. Who are the victims? But also, who are the perpetrators? Is it just nuclear weapon states presidents, their nuclear engineers, the military, the journalists who didn't cover the injustices, everyone in nuclear weapon states countries who did not contest the nuclear industrial complex, everyone on a global scale can share some levels, as Ekaterina says, citizens, particularly citizens of nuclear weapon states, have a responsibility toward nuclear justice. They can contribute through education and through activism. So with that in mind, since nuclear justice is really one of the largest global quests for reparative justice is how do we get all of these victims and all of these perpetrators to sit together for reparative justice, which consists in broadly accepted definitions in 1, apologies, 2, reparations, and 3, future accountability. It seems to me that each step is very fraught. Apologies are not being offered because that would open the door to further responsibilities. Reparations, as Ruairí discussed extensively, are a very complicated goal because this is the scope of the crime is such that this is not something that money can fix. And as Ruairí also mentioned, remediation is not reparation. Remediation does not bring us back to a pre-nuclear state. So what form can apology take? What form can reparations take? What form can accountability take? How can we really dissuade perpetrators from committing further crimes? These are questions that I think I would love to hear your takes on. Just a final thought here, bouncing back on what Ekaterina was saying. I think we should dream big. I think we should not stop at wondering what is realistic and what is unrealistic and what is utopian and what is not, because they will take care of curtailing our dreams when we sit at the negotiation table. So it is as unrealistic and utopian to think that we can achieve true nuclear justice as it is to think that some crimes can be perpetrated without accountability. So thank you again, everyone. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on what forms apology can take and what form accountability can take, given this global scope of who are the victims and who are the perpetrators.
Thank you so much, Anais, for raising those very important questions, and I'm excited to hear our speakers' thoughts on them. But before that, I'm delighted to introduce our second discussant, Ian Fleming-Joe. Ian is a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, where he is investigating the interplay between economic sanctions and non-proliferation with a specific focus on North Korea's nuclear program. Concurrently, he is a research fellow at the Arms Control Negotiation Academy and FRS's Ballistic Missile Non-Proliferation Youth Group. Previously, Ian served as a research fellow at the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. And Ian, I will now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Elaine, and thanks a lot to our speakers for the enlightening conversation. It is truly remarkable that we are having this discussion today, especially in light of the recent developments that have taken place in the US Senate that just approved a significant bill to broaden and prolong the Radiation Exposure and Compensation Act. And let's not forget the diplomatic breakthrough that occurred in late 2023 when the UN General Assembly considered a resolution specifically focused on addressing the legacy of nuclear weapons, titled Addressing the Legacy of Nuclear Weapons. This resolution recognizes the importance of providing victim assistance and environmental remediation to member states affected by nuclear weapons testing. It's a significant step forward in acknowledging the needs of those who have been impacted by nuclear testing and use, and it demonstrates the growing commitment on the international stage to confront these challenges head on. The disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons is evident in the historical and ongoing suffering of affected communities, as our speakers pointed out, from the first nuclear test in New Mexico to the devastating attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The legacy of nuclear weapons testing and use has left a trail of destruction, illnesses, and intergenerational trauma. The presentations by the speakers illustrate the importance of broadening our perspectives on nuclear justice, from Mona Lisa's focus on the sourcing of nuclear fuel as a critical aspect that often receives less attention in discussions around nuclear justice. It is essential to prioritize this issue as part of our broader efforts to address the social, environmental, and ethical implications of nuclear power generation. Ruairí's exploration of nuclear justice as a human rights issue and Ekaterina's focus on the responsibilities of nuclear weapon states offer complementary insights into the multifaceted nature of the complex issue. This enriches our understanding of nuclear justice by highlighting the interconnectedness of various justice claims and the need for a more inclusive approach. All of the speakers rather have emphasized the intersectionality of nuclear justice, acknowledging its connections to broader issues such as human rights, environmental protection, and geopolitical power dynamics. This recognition of the interconnectedness of various justice claims is crucial for developing holistic approaches to addressing nuclear justice. Ekaterina's acknowledgement of her perspective as an individual from the Global South highlights the importance of centering marginalized voices in discussions on nuclear justice. This is also very close to my heart as an individual from the Global South, which I find to have been disproportionately affected by the nuclear cycle. Coming back to Ekaterina, her insights serve as a reminder that the current nuclear order perpetuates inequalities that affect non-nuclear weapon states more than they do nuclear weapon states. And any efforts towards nuclear justice must prioritize the interests and concerns of these nations. And then when it comes to important question, they both raised important questions, all of them raised important questions about policy implications of nuclear justice, particularly in terms of victim assistance, environmental remediation, and engagement between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Moving forward, it will be essential to translate these theoretical discussions into concrete policy actions that address the needs and aspirations of affected communities. Just for interest's sake, I would want to find out if you all found that there was a link between colonization and most of the nuclear policies or some of the effects of the nuclear cycle. It would be a very interesting conversation to have, because I've been looking at decolonization of the nuclear policy field, and the nuclear order itself, it's founded on colonial aspects that are meant to subjugate individuals from the Global South. So it will be a very interesting conversation for us to have. Finally, our speakers emphasized the need for collaborative action and dialogue to advance nuclear justice, whether through bilateral engagement, multilateral frameworks, or technical conferences. There is a consensus that meaningful progress requires the participation and cooperation of all stakeholders, including states, civil society, and international organizations. This discussion has provided valuable insights into the complexities of nuclear justice and the pathways towards a more equitable and sustainable nuclear order. And I would just want to take this opportunity to also thank EVN, the EVN team, for the past policy cycle, or rather we are still in the policy cycle on this subject matter. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian, for your thoughts and questions and for synthesizing everyone's remarks so nicely. And we now have so many excellent insights and questions to work with. And with that, I'll turn to my colleague, Declan, to lead the discussion session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elaine, and you've done an excellent job at hosting so far. And yeah, thank you to all of our speakers and discussants. So yes, my name is Declan Penrose, and I am a policy fellow at BASIC, and I work on the Inclusive International Security Program, and I help run the Emerging Voices Network. So I first like to thank the APLN, specifically Elaine and Tanvi, for helping organise this important and timely debate, as well as my colleague Anahita. I'd also like to thank our excellent speakers from both of our networks for their excellent and insightful contributions. So now I'd like to begin the floor discussions for this event and allow the audience to ask questions of our speakers and to continue the conversation on the search for global justice. So this will go on until just before about 11:30 on British Standard Time. So we'll have just over half an hour to go through the questions. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function. So first of all, I'd like to start this section by giving our speakers the opportunity to respond to our discussants' excellent points and questions. So if we'd like to open up, if any of the speakers would like to go first or to start, that would be excellent. If not, then I'll happily nominate someone. So I think just to start with, Katerina, if you have any, if you have responses to the questions from the discussants, yeah, that'd be really insightful to hear.
Well, thank you, Declan, and thank you for the questions and providing that food for thought, Anais and Ian. I will try to react to the points raised by Anais specifically. I'm not sure that I'm ready to answer the question about perpetrators, or maybe I'm not, sure that I would approach that from that angle, but I may try to react to that, sharing my thoughts about whose responsibility it is to provide nuclear justice, including within nuclear weapon states like my state, Russia. I believe truly that providing nuclear justice is not only the responsibility of states and not only something to be addressed on that high level or whatever level conferences or through technical cooperation mechanisms that I also mentioned. It is like our shared responsibilities as members of the international community. And I do understand that, it is only for states to provide some forms of justice through apology, through compensation mechanisms, etc. But we, concerned members of the international community, may provide some other forms of that justice, like historical and epistemic justice, for example. And I do believe that a crucial role here to be played by those specifically doing teaching or being engaged in educational and awareness-raising activities, especially in nuclear weapon states, and through covering nuclear justice-related topics in our activities, I do believe that we contribute to redressing that historical and epistemic injustices so that nuclear history is no longer whitewash. Mona Lisa has already raised that point, and victims are no longer invisible. So that would be my reaction to the first point raised by Anais. As for the second question about the forms of that justice to be provided, and I do agree again with Anais that we should dream big and we should be ambitious. But yes, on the other hand, we tend to focus. I believe that it is like multi-layered approach, and every actor and with every approach has a role to play in that enterprise. But usually dealing with that issues with like nuclear weapon states, constituencies and entities, we try to find something that could be like feasible, that could be like effectively promoted to nuclear weapon states. And that is why, for example, I mentioned that focus on specifically some technical aspects like environmental remediation and that form of assistance. I do understand, I do agree that that is different from apology, that is different from compensations, etc. But maybe implementing that sort of policies, be it like technical cooperation, be it, for example, information sharing, like declassification of that records. I believe that nuclear weapon states, if they do that, they act out of that responsibility and accountability. So sorry for being a bit chaotic, but that would be my response to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ekaterina. And there was a lot to cover in that. So many ideas and positions going around on this. It's of such an enormous topic to discuss. So yeah, I will look to one of our other panelists now. So Ruairí, if you have any responses to the questions from the discussants.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful discussions, wonderful questions, very broad. But I think that it's interesting that you, in the first instance, Anais, were discussing whether or not it should be either a reparative approach or a retributive approach. And I think this is something that kind of reminded me of an interesting concept that was put forward by a number of experts, I think most notably by the Peace Research Institute of Frankfurt, that they essentially said that it would be an interesting idea to apply a transitional justice approach to nuclear weapons testing, in that transitional justice is something that's generally used in the human rights context in situations where norms have shifted, where we've decided collectively that essentially this is something that was at the time both lawful and legitimate, but is now something that we've moved away from, and that we should apply the same approach that we would to a transitional justice issue generally, and that there should be approaches such as, the right to justice, the right to reparations, the right to truth, and kind of guarantees of non-repetition, which is something that I think, generally speaking, is something that can be applied to the issue of nuclear weapons testing as an overall framework, as a way of thinking about the issue, and it's something that maybe could be considered in respect of reparation. I think that as well, this touches off of a lot of what Ian was saying as well about more inclusive approach. I think that definitely there's elements of intersectionality in all of the obligations for nuclear justice. I touched a lot on human rights, but as well as this, there's a lot of overlap with international environmental law, with obligations in respect of, say, the principles of prevention, protection, other treaties that might fall into the bracket of nuclear testing as well. And as well as that, we're seeing more and more focus on potential this idea of ecocide. So there's definitely a lot of intersection at play, and this is a cross-dimensional issue, which definitely requires a lot of collaboration with other regimes. In relation to colonization and nuclear policy, I think that this is something that is seen most clearly through the testing regimes. From everywhere that testing took place, be it French Algeria, even in places like Maralinga in Australia, the French Pacific, or in say, for instance, Nevada or Native American land and places like this. It's most prevalent, and I think that these are communities that are still reeling from this today, and they're communities who have been marginalized and often ignored throughout history, and their inclusion is something that really needs to be affected in moving forward. I think that they've not only that, but even the engagement with communities that have been affected has been oftentimes from like a military research perspective and not a holistic, inclusive, medical, effective perspective. So I think that, and also in relation to Anais, to go back and forth again, but Anais's point of who are the perpetrators and who are the victims, I think we all are, both victims and perpetrators. We are part of the society that allowed this to be legitimate and to be the norm for so long, and we must all collaborate for a collective response. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for those excellent responses, and ended that on a very interesting point for everybody to think about going forward. So I'll just invite Mona Lisa to speak on their responses to the discussant's questions.
Yeah, thank you, Anais and Ian, for your questions, and also Ruairí and Ekaterina for your responses. I think Anais' question was pretty much answered by the last comment of Ruairí, but I still would like to maybe add my 1 cent to it by saying that it's definitely not very easy to find out or to point fingers at who are the victims and who are the perpetrators. And I'm saying this because given the complexities, and I'm speaking from the angle of uranium mining and the impact on indigenous community and native land, is that we have to see this from the lens of human health and environment, ethnic sovereignty, keeping lands in the hands of the community, protecting livelihoods and customs which are endangered by the efforts of mainstreaming nuclearism, and also questions of security and nuclear energy. So there is no straightforward answer to this. And I definitely don't have an answer to this. Like we as a whole, like Ruairí said, as a society, we let this happen. So we are, at the end of the day, we are all perpetrators because we were, I guess, unsuccessful in stopping this. And I guess to answer Ian's question on colonialism and nuclear policy, the research that I did on the village of Domyasiat in Meghalaya, India, I found that through actually a documentary, because there's very little written research on this, but the documentary that I found, it was like an interview series of this very powerful and very motivating indigenous women named Speliti Lingdo Langren, who became the face of this anti-uranium protest, which led to the dismantling of the KPM project that I mentioned during my intervention. And she was, I guess, the convergence point in initiating this dialogue for nonviolent activism and I guess the dialogue between the opponent and proponent. But even today, there is this us versus the foreigner sentiment in these regions, where the foreigner is seen as the Atomic Minerals Directorate and, in extension, the government of India for letting that project happen, even though that was stopped at the exploratory stage. But still, the lead up to that project is still felt by the people. So the foreigner being the AMD, and the us are the people who are, I guess, the indigenous communities and people from that village. So they see the directorate as this outsider who are trying to take away their land. And so that, I think that's where the idea of colonialism comes into place, because the people there are still, I guess, facing the cost of saying no to that project, because that village has been completely abandoned from what I found from my research. They don't have proper roads, electricity, forget about internet connections, and just one primary school, and of course, no secondary schools or colleges in that region, in that entire district. So I guess hopefully that answers your question on whether or not we have seen these things. At least that's what I found in my research on the Domyasiat village and this case. But I'm sure there are multiple examples all across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for another excellent response, and I think this is a really great start to our discussion, covering again a huge range of issues, and also a huge range of those who are involved, whether it's indigenous communities, the very isolated indigenous communities, some we hear even less of than others, and also the role that civil society has played in trying to bring these issues to the forefront, and that links quite well to the first question that we have from the audience. So Kudawashi Makiko, sorry, I've just put this question here to answer for you. Looking at the TPNW's consideration of the moral and humanitarian questions of non-proliferation and disarmament, how best can the TPNW be utilized to champion discourse on nuclear justice and and amplify, I believe that is, voices from marginalized communities. So I would first of all like to open up to if one of our discussants, if they would like to go first on this. Anais, if you are able to answer on that, or if you need a couple of minutes, then please say as well.
Thank you. And thank you to our panelists for your very, very fascinating answers. Regarding the question of the role of the TPNW and how we can amplify voices from marginalized communities, I'm not an international relations scholar, so I'm not going to provide grand insights on the legal workings of the TPNW, but I do think, and again, as Ruairí has said, the conversation is shifting. The conversation is shifting from a debate on state sovereignty to a more localized, as Ian was saying, a more intersectional approach on what are the consequences of colonialism. And what this treaty is doing is is putting to the forefront how eminently accidental nuclear weapons are, how there are only 9 states in the world, in the over 2,200 states, who have chosen nuclear weapons. So it's bringing it to the forefront of the conversation a different type of understanding about democracy, and the articles 5 and 7 are just wonderful tools. A Tahitian anti-nuclear activist, Chantal Spitz, who once said, "Nuclear exists because colonialism exists." And the current framework in which the TPNW is being discussed really puts this to the forefront.
Yeah, thank you very much for the really insightful response. I'll just pass that on to Ian, if you have any responses to that question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Declan, and thanks a lot, Kudakwashe, for the question. The TPNW, it does amplify nuclear justice. Let me answer how it amplifies nuclear justice. So it has the TPNW includes positive obligations regarding victim assistance and environmental remediation for states affected by nuclear weapons testing and use, and it does advocate. Its advocates can leverage these provisions to advocate for concrete measures to address the historical injustices and ongoing impacts of nuclear activities on affected communities. It also represents a normative shift towards stigmatizing nuclear weapons and prioritizing humanitarian concerns. By promoting the treaty's principles and objectives, advocates can challenge the legitimacy of nuclear weapons and promote alternative approaches centered on peace, disarmament, and human security. Civil society organizations also play a crucial role in advancing nuclear justice and promoting the TPNW's objectives by raising awareness, mobilizing public support, and holding governments accountable. Civil society can help amplify the treaty's impact and ensure its effective implementation. State parties to the TPNW can exert international pressure on nuclear-armed states and nuclear-reliant states to join the treaty and fulfill their disarmament obligations. Through promotion of universal adherence to the treaty, advocates can strengthen the global norm against nuclear weapons and advance nuclear justice on a global scale. The treaty itself presents a very interesting dynamic. You find that its participation of civil society, it leans towards majority of them come from the global south, which is very interesting compared to those from the north. So there is a role that the global south civil society can play to amplify nuclear justice, considering that they're the ones who are disproportionately affected by nuclear tests and the nuclear cycle itself. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Ian, for a very, very thorough answer to the question. Again, a very interesting perspective on the TPNW's work on this topic, and bringing in marginalized voices. So I'll bring in now our speakers into the discussion, and maybe go in a different order this time. Mona Lisa, do you have any responses to the question?
I guess regarding TPNW, I wouldn't be the right person to answer, probably Ruairí or Ekaterina. But I guess, which was already raised by Ian, that the incredible role that civil society can play in this discourse is extremely important. So I wouldn't go too long, and I'll pass it to my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that. Yes, no problem at all. So yes, I'll pass on to Ruairí, if you are able to answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just kind of echoing what Ian said. I think that the importance of having affected individuals and examples of affected environments and communities and those who are in place on the ground to deal with these issues is really important, and it was crucial, I think, in the humanitarian and impacts of nuclear weapons discussions in the lead up to the TPNW being formed. I think that the presence of the Hibakusha and those who were affected was really impactful on me personally, and I think on states parties as well during the discussions. And I think that continued engagement is really key in meetings at states parties and in intercessionary periods. And also in the intercessionary working groups as well. There should be efforts made continuously to increase participation of affected communities in those discussions too, because that's where a lot of the groundwork and the foundation is laid for the work in the meeting of the states parties. On a practical level, I think that inclusion of these individuals and communities is quite difficult across all international organizations and discussions. I think that it's something we see across the board, perhaps amplified a bit more in the TPNW, where funding is an issue. But I think that, more engagement, perhaps or more allocation of funding for in-person participation is crucial, but also certain practical elements like doing more things online. I know that the conference, the African Ban the Bomb conference last year was entirely in an online forum, and I know that definitely improved participation of affected individuals and states that would maybe have not been able to even overpass or overcome the visa obligation, which is another major issue for affected communities taking part in these discussions. So I think that those are it for me.
Yes, thank you very much. Some excellent points. The visa issue, especially, it's so common stories that we have. For example, in the Emerging Voices Network, people trying to go to, MPT, RevCons or the TPNW MSP. So frequently we have people having issues with their visas. It's a really important point to make on that. And so I will just open up to Ekaterina, if you have any responses to the question as well.
So thank you, Declan. I would just actually add a bit to something Ruairí shared, developed maybe to a degree. I do believe that the best ever platform to amplify voices from marginalized communities was actually something from the history of the TPNW. So that were the conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. I still believe that is maybe the best way to go. On the one hand, I mean, ideally, but practically, we do know, and Ruairí already mentioned all of that, like financial issues and technical issues and stuff like that. So ideally, that is the platform. I have my other thoughts about that, but just in my research, I just focused on that. Engagement of nuclear weapon states, and I have some like ideas about the final conference that was held like in Vienna in 2022 was that year. So it was seen as a bit, like sort of merged with the TPNW meeting, but that is another story. So long story short, I do believe that historically it proved that the conferences were the best actually platform to amplify that voices like inclusively. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it's definitely important to bring up the humanitarian, conferences and also, the TPNW coming from, the humanitarian initiative and it's kind of embedded in its history, kind of from day one. So thanks everybody for their responses to the first question. In means of because of time limits, this next question will be our last one. But it is from Joanne van Wyk, who is from Pretoria, South Africa. Joe's produced some excellent work on this subject, by the way, well worth reading. So Joe has asked that, thank you very much for your insightful presentations. What lessons can be drawn from local communities' own efforts to make do in these terrorscapes? So again, I think I'll go to the discussants first. If any of our discussants, if Anais, if you would like to start the conversation on that, or if not, then let me know and I will pass on to somebody else.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I think having grown up in one of these terrorscapes, the country known as Maui, where France detonated 193 nuclear and thermonuclear weapons, the main feeling that describes the situation is love. And that's really amazing to see that the love that exists and is stronger than ever for the islands from the overwhelming majority of people in the country. So we really have a sharp contrast here between nuclear colonizers and the nuclear participants in the nuclear industrial complex in general, who go from geographic location to geographic location, destroying it and just moving on. And the affected communities who live in those terrorscapes, I really like this concept, who continue to love the land despite the scope of the devastation. And the narrative to describe the effects of nuclear colonialism and the nuclear industrial complex, we should not replace the narrative of progress that puts nuclear technology as the culmination of science with a narrative of decay that would suggest that things are just getting worse and worse. From affected communities, it's neither utopian progress nor dystopian decay. It's more of a narrative of cyclical crisis, a cyclical, usually colonial inflicted crisis. For example, in Maui, we first had epidemic genocides that killed 90% of the population, then nuclear colonialism, and now climate change. And despite those three apocalyptic events, Maui Nui is still exists, and Maui people and allies still love the land and will continue to fight for it. So yeah, there is something beyond the terrorscape.
Yeah, wow, thank you very much. It's a very inspiring start to that conversation, and talking about love and caring for that land still despite everything that's going on. And of course, often with these places that have been subject to these different kind of violences and subject to testing and mining, these places are also often have many other vulnerabilities regarding the environment, are often places, again in the global south that are either geographically placed in areas where they're more subject to environmental issues, or places where they do not have the same resources to deal with issues, and obviously was done without consent. So it's a really important start to this discussion. So I'd like to bring Ian in next if you have any remarks on the question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Declan. Thank you very much, Professor Van Wyk, for the question. I would say community resilience is very important. If you look at following the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, local communities in Fukushima demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. The residents were organizing community kitchens to provide meals, and they also established volunteer groups to assist in the cleanup efforts and supported each other emotionally through community gatherings and counseling services. So despite the ongoing challenges of radiation and contamination and displacement, these communities here show resilience in rebuilding their lives and livelihoods. And to just add more to what Anais was saying right now, when it comes to the Inuit communities in Canada, there was also a demonstration that traditional knowledge and practices are also very important, because therefore the people had experienced this, so information could be shared down, and elders were passing down knowledge about sustainable hunting and fishing practices, as well as techniques for identifying and avoiding contaminated food sources. Also, we also saw community-led initiatives with the Navajo Nation in the US. The Navajo Nation was affected by uranium mining and contamination. They spearheaded community-led initiatives for environmental remediation and healthcare. Organizations like the Navajo Uranium Radiation Victims Committee have advocated for government accountability and compensation for affected communities. Community members have also established grassroots programs for water testing, health education, and support for affected individuals and families. It is within this context that you realize the importance of including these voices when we have these discussions, because they have had the first encounter or the first-hand experience of the effects that we are discussing here. And it's very concerning when you enter into rooms and then there is lack of representation of the voices that have actually suffered at the hands of nuclear testing and the nuclear cycle. So I would also add interdisciplinary collaboration, like one that was seen at Chernobyl, and also international solidarity when it came to the Pacific Islands as well.
Thank you very much, Ian, for all those incredible examples on that. Is really, really insightful answers to the question. So yeah, now I'll open it up to the speakers. Ruairí, if do you have any responses to the question?
Well, there were two very good responses, so I'll try and maybe echo a bit of what was said before. Yeah, just broad inclusion overall, and yeah, the ability. I really liked what you were saying about resilience and how people are resilient by nature, and they'll find a way, especially when these things are of critical importance to them, like their culture, their language, their practices. And this is something that we have seen across all of the numerous communities that have been affected, whether it's the Marshallese or those communities in French Polynesia, in Australia. We see that these things are constantly part of their agenda, these things, and they should be in the international agenda too, to factor these in our discussions when we consider victim assistance, when we consider environmental remediation, is these elements like culture, like language, like practices. So yeah, just that yeah, these things aren't always black and white, and these things should be definitely factored into a more holistic approach. Yeah, really can't beat what was said before.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, we've had some excellent responses to that. So I'll just invite Mona Lisa. Do you have any remarks on the question?
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey, and also thank you for the question. I guess first of all, I would like to just follow back on what Ian previously mentioned on the policy cycle that we worked on. I was fortunate to co-author a piece with Ian and 3 other amazing researchers where we talk about briefly on these topics that we are addressing today. The link of which I would shamelessly add to the chat for all our audiences to read. But to answer your question, a few cases that I've found in the past few years were from the Wakhan and Longstoin villages, also in the state of Meghalaya in India, where the directorate found some of the largest and richest sandstone type uranium deposits. So this, of course, are speculated. Nothing has been made sure. But ever since that announcement, based on the testimonies and interviews that I've seen and I've heard through friends who are based there, said that the locals have been taking a very proactive approach in this entire process. They want to know what exactly are the engineers and researchers are doing in their land. How is it going to impact them? They're keeping themselves informed on the potential impacts, and also organizing demonstrations, protests, and also writing petitions to the local government to make sure that what happened in Domiaset doesn't happen again in their villages. So yeah, I guess everybody are doing things and like taking up initiatives in their own ways. And these are just few examples of what people can do and what concerned citizen can do in this space. But yeah, these are just a few examples from Meghalaya.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's definitely important to also discuss like the variation in the different responses and all the different ways and different places that effective communities have responded and reacted. But they've all, of course, shown, as we said before, that resilience is the common theme throughout, but the variety is also fascinating. So yeah, I'll bring our last speaker onto this question then. So Katerina, if you have any remarks on this.
Thank you, Declan. Actually, my colleagues brilliantly covered that topics. If anything, I may add to that. I believe that maybe the focus on exchanging best practices, exchanging experiences and knowledge among different communities around the world, that would be something helpful. And I believe, again, from my focus, like the history of the TPNW shows that sense actually of that connection, that sense of community, of that people, communities, etc., united, by that common goal, to achieve that justice. It just, helps us, like human beings, to keep going. And maybe that is just that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Katerina. I think that's a really lovely point to and phrase to kind of end the discussion on that, and how everybody keeps going. And yeah, also just really interested in how it kind of shows the broadness of the issue as well of nuclear justice, how this is not just tied to weapons. If we're going to talk about uranium mining, we have to talk about all kind of nuclear technologies, and it's something that if we're going to embrace more nuclear, who knows what we'll do in the future, as a field as a whole, we all need to have a much better understanding of this and try to ensure that these issues don't happen again. So that brings us to the end of the discussion to this really interesting event. So thank you everybody for your questions and continuing this important debate. The search for nuclear justice continues, and we commend our colleagues and speakers for their work that strives for progress towards this vital issue. So I'd again like to thank the APLN and our speakers today for helping make this event deeply informative and inspiring. And I'd like to urge everybody to continue this conversation beyond this event and to take what you've learned today with you in your future work, regardless of what field you're working in or what the topic in terms of nuclear that you're working on. So the APLN has sought to work towards this goal, and through initiatives such as Understanding Nuclear Justice for the Pacific, Expert Insights. So in 2023, the APLN commissioned 3 reports from experts based in the Pacific Islands as part of the project on nuclear disarmament and the Anthropocene, voices from the Pacific Island countries. So I'm just going to put that quickly in the chat as well. Just posting the link here for everybody. Yes, so these reports highlight the inequalities and injustice of past and present nuclear weapons policies and practices that exacerbate existential risks in the region. At the EVN last year, as has been mentioned, we ran the policy cycle resulted in the anthology report, Desiloing Existential Threats, Challenging Identity, Power, and Inclusivity in the Nuclear Policy Field. And of course, one of the working groups in particular focused on the intersection of social justice, uranium mining, and nuclear testing. And in this last year, we've also engaged extensively with working humanitarian impacts at the EVN, including our past webinars, which you can find online. We will also be launching our upcoming publication on strengthening humanitarian impacts agenda within the NPT quite soon, which also explores key questions around nuclear harms and justice. And just to finish off, this webinar has been recorded and it will be available online in a few weeks if you wish to watch it back or if you've missed some of it and maybe joined later on. So I'd just like to end with this. So obviously we endeavour to keep working on this vital subject. And if we keep working together and prioritising this issue, we can make progress on the search for nuclear justice. As we said before, we can be ambitious, we can dream big on this. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And have an amazing rest of your day, depending on what time zone you're in. So yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.